Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Somova Basu, President and founder of the Council for Global Cooperation, and I would like to warmly welcome you all and viewers to today's session. Today's session is going to be a discussion on Belarus, and our webinar titles Belarus, War, Society and Foreign Relations. From the rigged 2020 presidential election, mass protests, increased repression and violent suppression of civil society to Russian ally in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Belarus continues to attract global attention from human rights observers and international communities. During the 2014 Maidan Revolution and the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, Belarus maintained a neutral stance and portrayed itself as a mediator and a donor of security and stability in the region. But with the emergence of the 2020 political crisis, Belarus under Lukashenko increased its dependence on the Kremlin and became Putin's major ally in the invasion of Ukraine. With the growing Western criticism of Lukashenko regime, Belarus continues to aid Russian invasion and military activity continues to carry on in the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. There are increasing speculations that Belarus will become more directly involved in the war. At the same time, the speculation of Russian absorption of Belarus and the new Chinese-Belarusian deal have made the political scenario of Eastern Europe more anent. Today's session, our speakers would discuss the Belarusian uprising of 2020, the pro-democracy movement, its involvement in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, as well as Belarus's relations with China and the world. The speakers will highlight their unconventional research on Belarusian history, society, politics, and foreign relations. Furthermore, would discuss and address the implications of these developments on the Lukashenko's regime and the future of the Europe's last dictatorship. Before I introduce our today's speakers, I would like to briefly lay down the event format for today. We have three speakers in the panel today. Each would deliver a lecture on the proposed webinar theme, and for that they would receive 15 to 20 minutes. After that, we will have an open forum in which the speakers can comment on each other's lecture, and we will have a floor to discuss. During this discussion, we also have the Q&A session. We request our participants to participate, and we hope you participate. You can easily drop your questions and comments for our speakers in the Zoom chat box, and we would definitely take them up. Thank you. And so coming to our speakers, let me just briefly introduce them. Today we have with us Professor David Marples, our first speaker. David Marples is a distinguished university professor at the Department of History and Classics at University of Alberta. He specializes in history and contemporary politics of Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine. And within CGC, he is an advisory chair to the Cold War Project and Genocide, Holocaust, and Disaster Studies Vertices. Professor Marples is the author of 16 single-authored books, and his publications include Understanding Ukraine and Belarus, Ukraine in Conflict, Our Glorious Past, Lukashenko's Belarus and the Great Patriotic War, and Heroes and Villains, Creating National History in Contemporary Ukraine, 2008. He has also edited 4 books on nuclear power and security in the former Soviet Union, Contemporary Belarus, and Ukraine. He has published over 100 articles in peer-reviewed journals. He is a former president of the North American Association for Belarusian Studies and is regarded as one of the leading Western authorities on the historical and socio-political aspects of the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe and Belarusian studies. Then we have with us Katsiaryna Lozka, who is a doctoral research fellow affiliated with Ghent University, Belgium, and UNU-CRIS, specializing in Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus. She holds a master's degree in EU International Relations and Diplomacy Studies from the College of Europe in Bruges and a master's degree in European Studies from Comenius University in Bratislava, Slovakia. She previously studied international politics and peace research at the University of Oslo and the Belarusian State University in Minsk. Her research interests include Eastern Europe and the South Caucasus, Russian politics, EU foreign policy, conflicts, peace, and security studies. Thank you for joining us, Katsiaryna. And then we have with us our last speaker, Maryia Danilovich. Maryia is a postdoctoral and Humboldt Fellow at the Center for Modern East Asian Studies, University of Göttingen. She has been affiliated with research organizations, and her research and teaching experience also includes working as an associate professor in international relations at the Belarusian State University. Over the last few years, she has been co-developing a digital humanities program for comprehensive analysis and mapping of China's Belt and Road Initiative, BRI. She obtained her PhD in 2015 for a thesis on China's foreign policy in Central Asia. Maryia's background in Chinese and Oriental studies allowed her as a part of her doctoral research to conduct fieldwork in Northwest China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Her current research areas include China's foreign policy developments and the adaptation and implementation of China's BRI in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Thank you for joining us, Maryia. We are delighted to have all our three speakers. Without further delays, I would like to go to our first speaker, Professor David Marples, who would deliver a lecture titled The Belarusian Uprising of 2020 and Relations with Russia. Over to you, Professor Marples.
Thank you very much. I had some discussions with Katya before we started today, so we kind of divided up duties a little bit, and I thought it might be useful for those who don't know much about Belarus to provide a bit of background leading up to 2020, and then Katya will start from there. I think I might need to be made a host in order to show slides. I've got a few slides.
Yes, Professor, you can share now.
Okay. All right. I hope they're clear enough. So when war started, or war was expanded, I should really say, in Ukraine in February 2022, the attack on Kiev was launched directly from Belarus, and it came after military exercises between Russian and Belarusian troops in what ended up as a failed attempt to capture Kiev and remove the Ukrainian government. And the map shows that Belarus has been very much involved in the war subsequently, with temporary and permanent bases for Russian forces, helicopter air bases, hospitals that deal with victims of the war on the Russian side. And the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, was initially very supportive of the war, although he later became a little more reticent once he realized that the war was not going entirely to plan. So I will talk a little bit then about how Lukashenko came into power in Belarus. I mean, how did it happen that someone would manage to be the president of Belarus for almost 3 decades, from the summer of 1994 to the present? And in 1994, my two fellow panelists, I believe, were probably not even born at that time. But 1994, I did attend the initial presidential election in Belarus, some of the campaigns. And it was quite a free and fair election. And Lukashenko was the temporary chair of a parliamentary commission on corruption. And he made his name in there. He was pretty well unknown before that. And he targeted the then premier of the country, Vyacheslav Kebic. Vyacheslav Kebic, I get it right. And you could see that in the first round, even though he was quite a popular candidate, he didn't win outright. He got 45.76%, and then a more emphatic victory in the second round. And elections followed rather erratically. There was no election in 1999 as stipulated by the Constitution, but there was one in 2001, and thereafter they've taken place fairly regularly, but they're very much controlled by the government. The government controls the electoral commissions. It investigates the candidates who wish to stand, and sometimes completely bars them on various grounds. And you can see in subsequent elections, nearly all of which ended in protests, Lukashenko's vote varied between 77 and 84.4% in the first round. So everyone was an outright victory, and much was dependent on the chair of the election commission, who we can see in this photograph, Lidia Yamashina. So Lukashenko controlled the elections, and I put a couple of photographs here which are quite illustrative. The one on the right is from 1994, where he's voting with his two sons in attendance. And then in 2015, his third son, from a different woman, Mikolai, is voting again. But it's the same process, really, a more or less ritualistic elections taking place every few years, and Lukashenko always running out an emphatic victor. And each of these elections has been manipulated, fabricated, with the opposition leaders usually ending up in jail at the end of the election. Perhaps most catastrophically in 2010, when of 9 presidential candidates who took part in the election in December of that year, 7 ended up in prison on the night of the election after mass protests in the center of Minsk. So it's a fairly violent procedure, but nevertheless, Lukashenko always ends up winning these elections. In addition, Lukashenko occasionally has resorted to outright violence and murder to remove his opponents. And I'll give the example of these 3 figures, although there are more than 3. On the left, Viktor Hanchar, who was his campaign chief in 1994, but subsequently joined the opposition and became deputy chairman of the Supreme Soviet or Belarusian parliament. And in September 1999, as Hanchar and Krasowski, Anatol Krasowski, his close friend who was a businessman, emerged from a sauna in Minsk, they were arrested and never seen again. Similarly, the former Minister of Defense, Yuri Zakharenko, was also kidnapped. And in 2019, in December, we learned from a former member of a police special unit that the people who were taken from the street, Hanchar and Krasowski, were taken to military headquarters, executed, and buried in graves that had been pre-prepared in a nearby forest. We also know that the head of this organization that carried out the executions was Dmitry Pavlichenko, the head of the special forces in Belarus, and that he's carried out these orders on a number of occasions. It's be unfair to say that Lukashenko relies entirely on kidnapping and executing his opponents. These are exceptional examples, but when necessary, he's done that when he thinks these figures are too threatening. Why was Hanchar so threatening? Because in 1999, when Belarus was supposed to have elections, Lukashenko canceled them, but the opposition carried out mock elections, and Hanchar was the leading figure in the country as deputy chair of the parliament to replace the president according to the constitution of 1994. So what are the bases of Lukashenko's control of the country? And I would say, first and foremost, is what he's called a social contract with the population, meaning that he agrees to provide basic living standards for the people. He will cover needs, wages, pensions, and in return, he should be trusted by the population. He's given the nickname Batska, or little father of the population, and that's how he likes to see himself, a kind of populist leader who communicates closely with the population and is a genuinely popular figure. But even though he does have some claim to have been popular for a certain amount of time, he has made sure of that by close control over the media, banning of some opposition media, replacement of editors, control over television, and widespread repressions of opposing figures, particularly opposition leaders who have spent periods in jail over the time of Lukashenko's leadership. He's also ensured close partnership with the Russian Federation, and that was one of the bases of his support in 1994, that he would return Belarus to a partnership with Russia, and that people who feared for their economic security without Russia would once again have this assurance that Russia would be standing behind Belarus. There are several organizations that represent this. The first is the Russia-Belarus Union, first initiated in 1996, but signed in a more fundamental way in 1999 with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. And I would say that until Putin became president, this was more or less a fictional organization. It had no real basis. It didn't meet very often. And there was no attempt, for example, to form a union in which Lukashenko would be power sharing directly with the Russian president and eventually taking over himself, which seems to have been his desire. There were many other formations, economic unions, a security union, and Belarus operated through this period with state-owned companies. There was no real economic reform. These countries often ran at a loss, but were subsidized by the government. Wages were fairly low. Before we started, I looked back on a paper that I published back in 1998, in which it was complained, people were complaining about the standard of living and low wages, but nevertheless, compared with their neighbors, Belarus seemed to live relatively well, and GDP was growing in this period. And it was growing as a result of cheap imports of oil and gas from Russia for the most part. Some of this oil was refined and then exported directly to neighbors in the European Union for the most part. And in this way, Belarus managed to survive economically as long as it had these Russian subsidies. It didn't mean that relations with Russia were necessarily always smooth. Lukashenko complained frequently about the rising price of oil and gas, and Russia in turn sometimes banned dairy products from Belarus and other goods on the grounds that they didn't meet Russian standards of hygiene. So there was this kind of argument taking place between the leaders of Belarus and Russia for most of the 21st century, but I would say starting really about 2008 or so. Lukashenko provided law and order and stability. Belarusians were safe from wars like the war that Russia initiated against Chechnya when Chechnya declared independence. Two wars starting from 94 to 97 and then renewed once Putin came into power. Belarus played no part in there. It was not asked to play any part. It didn't play any part when Russia and Georgia had a dispute over Georgian breakaways regions and Russian troops invaded. So even though Belarus was a member of these associations with Russia, it managed to stand apart and order its own society, and people appreciated that to some extent. Lukashenko also made periodic plunges into Europe. He signed an Eastern Partnership project with EU neighbors, including the 3 republics of the Caucasus, as well as Moldova and Ukraine. And this project really was supposed to bring Belarus closer to the European standards, modernize factories, introduce more democratic principles, and above all, to try to introduce more human rights in Belarus. And it included the partial releases of prisoners, but also an ongoing dialogue with the European Union that was supported by some factions of the Belarusian opposition. I would say that this dialogue never really came to any fruition. Once the prisoners were released, Lukashenko continued with the same repressive policies. And perhaps he did so because of the lack of unity among the opposition political parties. And just to give a brief example of this, at one time, Belarus had 3 social democratic parties, that is 3 different branches. It had 2 branches of the Popular Front, the first major opposition party founded in the late 1980s, but which split crucially by I think it was 1999, it split formally into 2 different wings, one inside Belarus, one outside Belarus, run by the original leaders Jan Pazniak, who is residing in Warsaw. He left the country in 1996. It also has a United Civic Party, a Women's Party, 2 branches of the Communist Party. So you can see that it has many political parties, which are all very small, and none of which has really had any major success in elections. Elections being the one time when the opposition can attempt to unify. And just to give one example, in 2006, the opposition came up with a unified candidate, Alexander Lukashenko, who was a professor based in the city of Vilnius. Is it Vilnius or Hrodno? I can't remember now. I'm sure my 2 colleagues can correct me on that one. It may be Hrodno. But in any case, no sooner had Lukashenko been nominated than the rector of the state university, Alexander Kazulin, announced that he was also running against Lukashenko, and he was a much more demonstrative candidate. And this immediately split the opposition and meant that there was no chance of either of them, even in a fair election, making it into the second round of the elections. So the opposition has never been fully unified until 2020, as Katya will explain what happened then. And lastly, talk a little bit about the basis of identity in Belarus under Lukashenko has always been based on the past, and particularly on the legacies of the Great Patriotic War. And that's why I ended up writing a book on that topic. Everywhere you go in Minsk, you can see memorials to the victory in the Second World War, or to the memory of the victims of the Second World War, with the main memorial at Hatyn, about 50 miles or so from Minsk. But there are many others. There's the Brest Hero Fortress in the west. There's even a Linia Stalina, or a Stalin line, a little closer to Minsk, that marks the original border of Belarus before the Soviet attack on Poland, which unified Belarus by annexing what is today known as Western Ukraine. And these monuments are meant to show that Belarus has reverence for the past, it has reverence for its heroes, and particularly for veterans of the war. Lukashenko changed the date of independence of Belarus from the 26th of July, when Belarus declared sovereignty in 1990, to July the 3rd, the date when Belarus and Minsk, the capital, was liberated from the Nazis in 1944. The main museum in Minsk is the War Museum, which was revamped in 2014 and now is a kind of model museum where Lukashenko takes many of his visitors when they come to visit the president. Belarusians are also portrayed as victims of this war. Earlier, there was focus on the partisan movement, but today it's been transformed into a situation where Belarusians are now seen as the main victims of the war. And the most recent phenomenon is the slogan of genocide of Belarusians in the Second World War, where Belarusians replaced Jews as the main victims of the war, despite the fact that about 600,000 Jews died on what is today Belarusian territory. And it's linked to the creation of enemies, both outside the country, that is, the people who committed these crimes against Belarusians. An alleged 400 people are still alive and living in Central Europe, but also enemies within. And the opposition in Belarus today is equated with collaborators with the Germans in the Second World War, using as an example the state flag, the white, red, white flag, which was the flag used by the Belarusian National Republic, but which re-emerged for a while during the war and later became a symbol of the current opposition in Belarus. So Lukashenko has portrayed these people as enemies of the state and the war as the main event in the formation of modern Belarusian identity, which seems a little bit ridiculous given that it's almost 80 years since the war ended. And most of the people who live in Belarus today can no longer personally remember anything about the war. They simply know what they have from their grandparents and great-grandparents. But this legacy lingers, and it means that there are no other cultural figures in Belarus, or indeed victims of the Stalin period, for example, who are ever mentioned today in any kind of state narratives. So I think I'm roughly at 20 minutes. I'm not timing myself exactly, but I think it's basically at 20 minutes. So this is kind of the background to Katya's talk, which will follow and focus more closely on 2020 and what happened afterward. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Marples, for a wonderful lecture and providing us a background on the Belarusian history and the society, and also including the Holocaust and the issues of genocide, which we will definitely come during the question hour. We would like to discuss on that definitely. So for now, we would like to go to our second speaker, Katsiaryna Lozka, whose lecture titles The Belarusian Pro-Democracy Movement and Russia's War Against Ukraine. Over to you, Dr. Lozka.
Thank you so much, and many thanks for bringing together this event. Thank you so much, Mava, for chairing it, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion. In my talk, I will try to focus on the 2020 presidential elections, presidential campaign, I would say, in Belarus and its aftermath. So I'll try to shed some light on actually what happened next, picking up on some of the points that Professor Marples had already raised. On August 9, 2020, another fraudulent elections took place in Belarus. And on that night of August 9-10, thousands of people went to the streets to protest the election fraud. Already in 2 weeks, on August 16 and then August 23, hundreds of thousands of people flooded the streets of Minsk, but also other cities and towns of Belarus. They were trying to demonstrate their opposition to the regime, and this dissent and this opposition is still present there. In my talk, I want to focus on 3 dimensions. One, why this presidential campaign became different and what triggered the society to massively mobilize against the authoritarian rule. Number 2, why the regime has not collapsed yet, so why it's still there in power. And number 3, how the pro-democracy movement of Belarus has transformed in the past 2.5 years. So what do we have now? How can we describe the situation in Belarus, and what are perhaps some outlooks for the future? But I think we'll discuss it in the questions perhaps. So I'll start briefly with the presidential elections, or so-called elections because of the fraud. The elections that were held in Belarus back in August 2020 marked a critical juncture in the country's modern history. After ruling for, back then, 26 years, Alexander Lukashenko declared himself president of Belarus for a 6th term. From an outside, in early 2020, the situation might have seemed rather manageable because many of the conditions that Professor Marples had described were there. The traditional opposition parties were still marginalized, rather weak. The economic protests that took place in Belarus a couple of years before that had been suppressed. The ruling elite did not really show any signs of dissent, and the West reluctantly was expected to accept yet another fraudulent victory of Lukashenko. However, the events quickly spiraled out of control, and there are several factors that contributed to that, to the 2020 national awakening, as we like to call it, in Belarus. One is perhaps the primary cause that was and is still there, and it's a growing conflict, I would say even a gap, between, on the one hand, a modernizing, educated, and increasingly liberal society in Belarus, and on the other hand, the ruling regime that clings on outdated values and beliefs that no longer resonate with at least part of the population, the regime that rejects any idea of change and governs through a network of loyal, but at least potentially ineffective administrators and security officials. This gap did not really erupt back in 2020. It has been boiling for quite some time, but the situation exploded back then. And I think if a series of Lukashenko's own mistakes contributed to what actually happened back in 2020. This mistake, number one, is the mismanagement of the COVID-19 pandemic. Lukashenko refused to acknowledge the severity of the COVID-19 pandemic, claiming that he cannot see the virus and it does not exist. So his lack of response to the pandemic essentially broke down the social contract that had been mentioned earlier. The society was left completely abandoned in the face of an existential threat, and it had to mobilize. The second factor is that although the regime had imprisoned the main opposition candidates, it underestimated the power of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, another opposition candidate who decided to run for presidency when her husband, Sergei Tikhanovsky, who had been imprisoned, was not allowed to run for presidency. So she decided to do it instead. So she gained a lot of support from the population, and most likely she won the elections, having been able to unite different groups of the population, regardless of the flag, the language, and the political views that people held back then. In response to this situation, to this, as I said, growing gap, but also aggravating economic conditions, to this new opposition and so on, the regime came up with only one solution, and this is to use violence and repressions. Since 2020, at least 50,000 people have gone through detention centers and prisons in Belarus, meaning tortures, humiliation, beatings. At least 6 people, according to the UN, were killed during the protests, but this number is higher. Over 1,500 political prisoners are still there in Belarus, and it's just the official number. It's likely to be almost 5 times higher, and this number has never gone down. In addition, hundreds of thousands of Belarusians had to flee. So why is the regime there? The protests that took place, essentially they started in May 2020 during the presidential campaign and were fully suppressed in the spring of 2021. They were the longest and most mass-scale protests in the whole region. And according to different estimates, around 1 million Belarusians took part in different forms of social mobilization, be it protests, be it digital activism, volunteer work, and so on. For the context, there are 9.5 million Belarusians and around 1.5 who live abroad. So for around 7 million population inside the country, that's a huge number. Nevertheless, in 2023, the regime is still there. And that's the result of many different reasons, both domestic and international. I just mentioned a couple, but we can discuss, of course, more. Reason number one is that the international environment was and is unfavorable. Russia, that was likely in preparation for escalation of its war against Ukraine, supported Lukashenko politically, financially, economically. Then the West, while providing rhetorical support for the pro-democracy movement of Belarus, did not really impose any significant sanctions. For example, the first round of sanctions came only 9 months after the elections, that also provided ample time for the regime to adapt and to find ways to circumvent the sanctions. The second, perhaps, reason is that security apparatus remained on Lukashenko's side, and there are different reasons for that. But also one of them is that the opposition in the beginning lacked some clarity in the messaging. While it was clear that the movement was against the regime, it was not always clear what the movement was for and why people should switch actually sides. Last but not least, the Belarusian protest, and I'm talking about 2020 because it has evolved a lot, lacked effective leadership during critical moments. Although there was and there is a unifying symbol, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the protest remained spontaneous, grassroots, and it's both a strength and the weakness of those protests. While the regime has been unable to completely crush the protests due to their disorganized nature, sometimes it was also this lack of effective leadership was present during the important moments. And so it took some time, for example, for the opposition to more effectively organize itself and mobilize from abroad and so on. Now, what's happening today? The political crisis that came to the surface in Belarus in 2020 remains unresolved. And I would say it has worsened both for the regime and for the society now in 2023. The regime has become even more dependent on Russia, and was been already mentioned, it had to provide in a way the Belarusian territory for the attack on Ukraine, paying off the debts for the support that had been provided back in 2020 and its aftermath. But for the society inside Belarus has been living in this constant fear and unprecedented repressions for the past almost 3 years, with even the relatives of activists who are based abroad being persecuted. So what are the features of the current situation? First, the political crisis that started as a domestic one is no longer the domestic issue of Belarus. Its internationalization happened in May 2021, when the Lukashenko regime decided to hijack the Ryanair flight flying between the two European Union countries to detain an opposition journalist, Roman Protasevich, who is on trial today actually in Minsk, and he is facing 10 years of imprisonment. Then the regime also artificially created the border crisis on the border with the European Union, and now it's also an active part of Russia's war against Ukraine. Number two is that the Belarusian opposition is now mostly in exile, but it did not stop to fight. There's been significant institutionalization, but also fragmentation of the opposition. Many different structures were created, including the Office of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the Coordination Council, the United Transitional Cabinet. The Belarusian pro-democracy movement gained unprecedented international recognition. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and the movement is received by senior officials from the West and from different Western countries. At the same time, there's been a growing frustration also among the supporters of the pro-democracy movement, because the change did not come as quickly as many had hoped for. And this has also led to increasing fragmentation of the opposition, with some groups, including the older opposition, but also some groups of this new opposition that I mentioned that emerged in 2020, becoming increasingly critical of each other. Third, and I'm coming to an end slowly, Belarusians have not given up their struggle for freedom and democracy. So the situation in the country is extremely repressive and difficult. At the same time, acts of resistance, including different small-scale acts of resistance, they still continue. At the start of full-scale invasion and Belarus' role in it became another trigger for the Belarusian society, because different opinion polls showed that more than 85% of the Belarusian population oppose it. So since 2022, different resistance acts were implemented, including the railway partisans of Belarus who are basically destroying Russian infrastructure and military transport, trying to prevent this transport from reaching Ukraine. People are also, inside Belarus, people are also mobilizing to support political prisoners. For example, every Saturday in the southeastern city of Belarus, Homel, there is always a queue in front of one of the prisons, and people are trying to deliver food and some basic goods to political prisoners who are not necessarily their relatives, but people are trying to express their solidarity and also often get detained for this. Another important aspect is the Belarusian diaspora that re-emerged as an important political actor back in 2020, and it remains really active, both, for example, in Ukraine, but in other countries, because many Belarusians back in 2020 had to flee to Ukraine, and some of them became double refugees. They had to flee the Lukashenko's regime first and then the war in Ukraine. But many of them, including journalists and doctors, they stay in Ukraine and try to help Ukrainians on the ground. To conclude, I think the future of the Lukashenko regime, but also Belarus, is shrouded in uncertainty, and all these developments have led to even more increased dependence of Lukashenko on the Kremlin and Putin's regime, which is also a temporary solution, as deteriorating economic but also political conditions for Minsk and Moscow make the long-term prospects for both regimes rather unclear. At the same time, what we also see is that the Belarusian society is becoming more disillusioned, perhaps. At the same time, it's not willing to give up on this fight for freedom. And people are not willing and not able to forget and to forgive the crimes that have been committed by the regime. So as a result, to briefly conclude, I think the present day situation can be described as a situation of a painful stalemate, and it's painful for both the regime and the Belarusian society. However, different developments and changes in the international environment, or perhaps the changes that other actors such as Russia, but also China, that Maryia will be talking about, might shaken the domestic situation or foster some change. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lozka, for taking up this interesting topic before us. And to the participants, I would like to request you can drop your questions in the chat box, and we would definitely take them up during the discussion hour. And so now we would like to go to our last speaker, Maryia. She would be delivering a lecture titled "3 Belarusian Myths About Relations with China." Over to you, Maryia.
Many thanks, Suma, and many thanks to my co-panelists for wonderful talks. As Katsiaryna already mentioned, I'm going to focus on the foreign policy dimension and more exactly on Belarus-China relations. And I'm going to talk about Belarusian myths about relations with China. And when I say myth, I mean misperceptions which have been held for years by the Belarusian officials and have been actively reproduced in the state media in Belarus. I will be speaking about 3 myths, and the biggest one is about the officially declared advanced level of bilateral relations, China-Belarus strategic partnership. In recent years, this strategic partnership received a whole list of emphatic descriptions, and the latest version is all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. It's the version from the last autumn. And from the perspective of official Minsk, in the first place by Lukashenko himself, close relations with China are a sort of extra pillar intended to uphold the Belarusian economy, state, and generally speaking, Belarusian regime itself. This all started in the mid-2000s when, as Professor Marples mentioned, China and Belarus had some problems in relations with Russia at that time. And Belarus really needed more partners, and China and Belarus declared their intention to cooperate more intensively. And for China at that time, it was just a part of its active connections with the developing countries around the world. Since that time, the Belarusian regime has been referring to China as its strategic partner and hoped for cooperation opportunities in trade, investment, and so on. And such references were mainly rhetoric, but the rhetoric was always embraced with more enthusiasm whenever relations with Russia were deteriorating again. And for China, this strategic partnership was switched on only in mid-2010s when China started to design and actively promote its Grand Initiative Belt and Road Initiative. And now we jump over the years and come to the events of 2020 and the dramatic developments which followed afterwards. We see that official Belarusian references to China are still very special. China is a special partner. Belarus positions itself as an important and reliable partner to Beijing. And one of the numerous examples, most recent ones in state propaganda, is the results of the so-called survey among the population. According to the survey, about 20% of Belarusians support closer relations with China. And China is their second priority after Russia. For all of you to better understand the context, I will just mention as a side note that this survey has been published, this survey results has been published prior to the state visit of Lukashenko to China this year. And it's quite obvious that the purpose was to show to Beijing how open the country is for closer cooperation. But if we look at this relationship the other way around, from China's perspective, we will see a bit different picture. In all those official emphatic descriptions of strategic partnership, for China, there has been much more rhetoric than concrete evidence. The studies which we conducted immediately after the 2020 the events of 2020 in Belarus show that for China, the partnership with Belarus has not been a type of special strategic partnership for global nature, of the geopolitical, geoeconomic nature, but just one of the multiple mutually beneficial partnership China has with many countries. This is a pragmatic and functional foundation for cooperation in those spheres in which China needs closer ties and China takes interest in. A more specific example is Belarus is a member of Eurasian Economic Union, and for China it was very important to have relations with Belarus and to develop joint industrial projects on the territory of Belarus, so that the goods produced there would go to the markets of the Eurasian Economic Union, and this could have facilitated closer relations between Belarus, between China and the Eurasian Economic Union, even coming to the free trade zone. And what's more, according to the results of the survey we have conducted among the Chinese scholars, China is traditionally seen, Belarus is traditionally seen in China as a part of Russia's sphere of influence. It's very important because in China there is this long-time predisposition of Chinese scholars and experts who work on the post-Soviet space, the predisposition to be Russia-focused. And it's important because when it comes to question of Belarusian sovereignty, generally speaking, this is not that crucial for Chinese experts, for Chinese policy advisors, and for Chinese policymakers. The second myth is about the rapid development of bilateral trade between China and Belarus, especially during the last decade. Since the mid-10s, China became the second largest importer to Belarus, and by 2020, it became the third largest trading partner after Russia and Ukraine. And even more, last year, 2021, for quite obvious reasons, China took over Ukraine's position and became the second largest trading partner for Belarus. Additionally, since the last year, officials in Belarus have been praising the unprecedented growth of exports to China. This is one side of the picture we see. But if we look at the bilateral trade statistics a bit closer, we can see several more specific points. First of all, there indeed has been an increase in Belarusian exports to China. According to China statistics, last year it was 65%, but the imports coming from China to Belarus still invariably dominate bilateral relations and bilateral trade, and the share comprises around 70% of bilateral trade. In other words, the trade balance is hugely negative for Belarus, and a lot of Chinese goods, equipment, machinery, accessories all come to Belarus, while Belarus sells only 2-4% of its exports to China. Second point, if we look at what is exported from Belarus and how much is exported from Belarus to China, we will see that this highly praised growth of Belarusian exports accounts exactly for the almost threefold increase of selling chemical and mineral products, especially sanctioned potash fertilizers. And only after this come agricultural products and more traditional export item, Belarusian wood. And here comes a very interesting issue of discrepancies in trade statistics. The Chinese side reports, for example, in the last two years, the figures which are lower than those reported by Belarus. And the discrepancy of this, for these figures of imports imports from Belarus to China are about $200 million. And here we should keep in mind that first, last year, Belarus became the second largest exporter of potash to China. And second, Belarusian officials don't show the statistics on potash and oil and petroleum products anymore, starting from the year of 2021. That's why we can only guess why there are these discrepancies and what stands behind them. And the last point is that a broader picture of trade of Belarus in recent years shows that under sanctions, within the last 2 years, Belarusian trade went down, both exports and imports, especially with the countries of the so-called non-community of independent states space. So the countries, basically CIS, some of the countries which are the part of the post-Soviet space. And now Belarusian officials are trying to redirect the country's trade flows. China is indeed the second trade partner, but at the same time, it's incomparable to Russia. For example, last year, China accounted for 7% of trade, foreign trade of Belarus, while the figures for Russia are enormous, 65%. And the last myth is closely interlinked with those which I already talked about, and it's about the highly important role of Belarus in China's Belt and Road Initiative. When China launched this Belt and Road Initiative a decade ago, the overall context was naturally different from the one we have now. China took an interest in Belarus because of its location, its transport infrastructure, and also its position as a relatively stable and predictable partner with an unchangeable regime at the time. And the regime in Belarus really wanted to become a part of the Belt and Road. It wanted reputational benefits, material benefits, and also strategical benefits for relations with both Russia and the European Union. But at that time already, the regime overemphasized the role of Belarus in the Belt and Road, and it expected huge support and high investment from China. And as I already mentioned, the views from China were a bit different. One of the most known examples is that both sides launched a joint industrial park in Belarus. They called it a model Belt and Road project, but the visions of both sides on this project has been rather different. Belarus expected it to be a basis for developing high technologies, green technologies, and logistical services oriented to the West. And China saw it as a project which should evolve according to the Chinese experience of industrial parks and focus on products that comply with China's technical standards, basically to sell these products later on the markets of the Eurasian economic space. This led to contradiction of interests. And additionally, Chinese diplomats, Chinese experts continuously called attention to the shortcomings of the Belarusian economy and the risks for Chinese investors and enterprises. China's investments in Belarus were not as impressive as wished by Minsk. This is one side of the Belt and Road story before 2020, and another side is transit via Belarus. In the last decade, we all know that China, European Union rail freight grew up significantly, and especially because of the Northern Road, which comes via Belarus, the Northern Road of China-Europe Railway Express. And this worked internationally for the image of Belarus as a transit country along the Belt and Road. However, then came the events of 2020 and the aftermath of 2020, and Belarus headed into huge economic meltdown. And for Chinese partners, this proved the mentioned risks of poor investment climate in Belarus, unstable legislature, and regarding transit, even more uncertainty for China came after Lukashenko threatened to block rail traffic between Germany and China in 2021. Then the same year, Belarusian authorities literally created a migrant crisis on the Belarus-EU border, weaponizing it against the EU neighbors. And finally, when Russia's invasion of Ukraine started last year, China faced even more uncertainty about the northern road, as the volume of rail freight along it, transported between China and Europe, fell sharply. Transported via Belarus, via Russia, especially eastwards, because of the moral boycott of Russia in the European Union, and more cargo owners have returned to sea freight. To conclude about Belt and Road and to conclude my short talk, I also cannot but mention the most recent developments, the agreement between Russia and Belarus on the deployment of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus. Chinese official media, I would say as usual, tend to retell the narratives created by officials in Belarus and in Russia. They talk about the threat from the West to these countries. But for China, for sure, this development is a very unpleasant surprise. And this is unpleasant not just for China as another nuclear weapon state, but also for China with the country which develops Belt and Road, and for China for the future security of its Belt and Road routes, and for the future security of its connections with Europe. I'd like to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maryia, for your lecture, and it was wonderful to hear all our three speakers. So now coming to our discussion forum, I would like to ask. I have a question which I would like to highlight. Like recently, we have been hearing the Belarusian absorption plan, which has recently been leaked by the Russian documents. I would like to know a few highlights on that from our speakers. I would like to start with Professor Marples. If you could highlight a few points on the Russian absorption plan for Belarus, and to what extent is this really believable or significant? And do you think Russia is in the way to its imperial or the Great Russia campaign, Greater Russia campaign in Eastern Europe?
Well, Russian motives are never very easy to discern. And there are wide debates about why the war was expanded and whether Ukraine is kind of a starting point for general expansion on some kind of imperial basis, where areas that were in the former Russian Empire could be integrated today within Russia. And I think you've seen some examples in places like Kherson, where once the Russians occupy the region, they've put up things like Russian signs, changed streets to Russian names, they've deported children to Russia for re-education. In other words, they're creating a kind of Russification, or if you like, ethnic cleansing that we've not seen in Europe since the wars in Bosnia. You know, this is really the only example one could give since the Second World War of this kind of campaign taking place. And it relates to to another question from Panos, who asked in the chat. But I think this is more important for Russia than any kind of threat from NATO enlargement. And I think the whole question of NATO enlargement is a red herring, quite frankly. And you note that when countries like Finland have declared that they want to join NATO, there's been very little protest from Moscow. In fact, Putin even said that that's their choice if they want to do that. So it's clearly nothing to do with NATO enlargement that Russia is deploying such policies in Ukraine. It's more a question of a revival of the Ruski Mir, or Russian world, and the extent of that Russian world, which includes Belarus. And there's no question that if Putin denies the existence of any kind of Ukrainian state, the same goes for Belarus. But it's not an invasion, it's more of a systematic takeover by having armies there, military bases there, now the prospect of almost immediately stationing nuclear weapons in Belarus that can only be fired on the orders of Moscow. And this is integration by another name. I mean, it's not by military force, because you've got a leader in Belarus who's playing along, who's cooperating, even while trying to maintain some kind of sovereign existence. But more and more, it seems to me that's the case for Belarus as well. It could theoretically be applied in Georgia, where you've got the basis for a breakaway state already with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and also in Moldova, where you've had a breakaway state since the early 1990s, but also periodically pro-Russian leaders of Moldova. You haven't got that now, but you've got mass demonstrations which are being fomented by pro-Russian forces, if not by Russia itself. So I think the only reason why this is not taken on greater dimensions is because the Russian army has performed so badly in Ukraine. You know, this is kind of the delaying factor, but that's where I see the aims of the Kremlin and the Security Council are moving very much in that direction, that Russia is now taking what it perceives to be its legitimate areas of control, and Ukraine and Belarus are at the very center of that.
I would like to ask Katsiaryna regarding this. You mentioned about the public opinion, and you mentioned that large amount of citizens in Belarus are against this war. But I would like to quote this Chatham House the survey, where it states that 50% thinks that Belarus should remain neutral. And in the same survey, 33% expressed their support for Russian actions, and 25% supported complete neutrality and expulsion of foreign troops. However, they think of a neutral stand. So I just wanted to know why is this vast differences in this survey, where it shows that people of Belarus still is hesitant about thinking Russia as one of their enemy, or this if what Professor Marples was saying, like if this is an imperial agenda of Russia to integrate regions of Eastern Europe. So I would like to know this from you. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for this excellent question. And just as a side remark, also before I start kind of trying to shed some light on this, public opinion and what it means, I want to say that any public opinion polls in authoritarian context should be also taken with a grain of salt. So because you can imagine the conditions in which they are conducted and how they are conducted and who can be reached and to what extent people can say what they think. So, but still these numbers should be taken into account. So what I mentioned, this more than 85% is the percentage of the population that opposes the war. And perhaps picking up on what Professor Marples was saying about memory politics and so on, I should mention that this cult of World War II, or the Great Patriotic War, as it's known in Russia and Belarus, has been constructed in radically different ways in Russia and in Belarus, even under Lukashenko, because this cult of the Great Patriotic War gained momentum in Russia under Putin, and it also it has underpinned Russia's aggressive policies in its neighborhood, because we know that Russia's war against Ukraine is constructed as this fight against Nazism and so on and so forth. So in Russia, there are ideas about this military irredentism that we can repeat and so on. And this has not been the case for Belarus, that suffered enormously during World War II. And it's the country that perhaps had the highest number of victims back then, or perhaps together with Ukraine at least. So for the people of Belarus, the war is a sign of tragedy. It's not something that they would say we want to repeat. And this is where this is perhaps how we can explain this huge difference in public attitudes also towards the war if we compare Russia and Belarus. At the same time, as you said, it does not mean that the whole of the population, or this 87%, support Ukraine. The public opinion is divided. From what I see, more or less, these figures change, and these Chatham public opinion polls that you also mentioned, they're regularly conducted, I think updated every 3 or so months. we see that around 30%, 32.5% side with Russia's narratives and a little bit more side with Ukraine's narratives. But we also have to kind of keep in mind that since 2020, the Belarusian population has been exposed to Russian disinformation, Russian propaganda, which plays a huge role, I think, in explaining also some of the differences. But then, despite, as you said, the war and what's been happening, more than 70% of Belarusians have maintained largely benign attitudes towards Russia. And I think one part of the explanation that can be used also here is that some Belarusians might try to look at Russia and what's happening there through the prism of their own domestic situation. I mean that at present, many Belarusians, they do not associate themselves with the regime. So the regime decided or allowed the use of the Belarusian territory for Russia's attack on Ukraine, but it's against the will of the Belarusian people. People voted against Lukashenko and so on. And so perhaps some Belarusians kind of look at Russia through this similar prism, trying to differentiate between Putin's regime and the Russian people. That might be one of the explanations that people in Belarus have kind of better, closer understanding of what the authoritarian context means. But yes, you're right, the public opinion is extremely complex and it's also in flux. And again, I'm not sure to what extent people can openly express their views when they're asked who they support in the context when wearing yellow and blue ribbons, you get several years of imprisonment and so on.
Yes, and exactly. And you mentioned about the Holocaust issue, which has been in World War II, has been similar for Ukraine as well as Belarus. So does there, the memory politics, which also Professor Marples mentioned, so is there any linkage or common feeling that Ukrainians share with or have this feeling of solidarity for Belarusians? Like, there is also a question regarding this, which asks that please comment on the history and current challenges of cooperation between pro-democratic movements and organizations in Belarus and Ukraine. So is there any sort of cooperations between the Ukrainian political parties or groups with the opposition groups in Belarus? And what are the challenges, if there are challenges? Yes.
Perhaps I would start, or would you? I don't know.
Katsiaryna, you go first.
Okay. Yeah, perhaps I will start and then other panelists would add, because it's quite a complex question, I think, and it depends on which level you look at, because speaking about the highest political level, the situation, I think, is quite complex, because so far we have not had a meeting between President Zelensky and, let's say, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya as the leader of the Belarusian opposition. Ambassador of Ukraine in Belarus was recalled only a few days ago, and not in response to the full-scale invasion and Belarus' role in it, but in response to the meeting between Lukashenko and one of the so-called leaders of one of the unrecognized republics in Donbass. So here the situation remains quite tricky, I think, and partly because the Belarusian opposition, while it's been quite active internationally, it has quite limited leverage on what's going on inside Belarus. So Ukraine's primary interest is security. So in this regard, it's more interested in cooperating with the actors that can deliver on the security aspect. At the same time, I think people-to-people contacts, they have become more complicated for obvious reasons, but at the same time, I know there is a lot of cooperation between, for example, human rights defenders, between some feminist activists who, let's say, Belarusian feminist activists who help Ukrainians and so on. So I would say I would differentiate between the two levels at this stage, and this people-to-people level, while it's quite complex, it gives a lot more hope than the highest political one.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think in the past, when we had elections in, for example, 2010, I recall there was a discussion among two of the opposition candidates who we're having a debate on whether to approach not Ukraine, but Russia. That really, if there was going to be change in Belarus, it could come through Russia. And even though that may sound far-fetched today, at the time it obviously wasn't. I mean, the fact is Russia has never backed any opposition candidate in Ukraine. And it's always ultimately backed Lukashenko. So even though there were debates and arguments between them, they were always, on some level at least, willing to cooperate in order to stop any kind of opposition candidate emerging. And I think the fact that they've done this in the past has led them to kind of neglect the possibility of cooperating with similar parties in Ukraine. And particularly after 2014, when Poroshenko is the president, but also the previous pro-Russian president has been removed from power, which means that it would be very dangerous to cooperate directly with somebody like Poroshenko, even though he'd been around for a long time in Ukrainian politics. And I see a lot of opportunities missed, excuse me, on part of the Belarusian opposition, but more so on the Ukrainian side, that the Ukrainian side is really committing everything to some kind of cooperation, even with a dictator like Lukashenko, that this is probably a better bet for them because it's official than trying to deal with someone outside the country like Tsikhanovskaya, or even looking for potential opposition within the country. And despite the fact that, Belarus has an opposition regiment fighting on the Ukrainian side, this hasn't really changed. I think Ukraine has negotiated more with the official regime in Belarus. And in the past, despite the fact that Lukashenko is being a repressive leader, he's got on very well with many Ukrainian leaders. He got along well with Yushchenko. He got along pretty well with Yanukovych as well, which is probably more likely. But he's got along with Ukrainian leaders. They've cooperated. So that's, I think, where the situation is. And it's a very difficult one to approach because how do you change the thinking on the Ukrainian side, given this struggle for existence? And I think this is where Ukraine's priorities are lying. So Maryia, I don't know if you want to comment as well.
All right. I think the best way would be for me to focus on the questions on China, which I see now in the window, because
yes,
I think David and Katsiaryna perfectly described the situation with Ukraine, and I see this question about Lithuania and the ports of Lithuania, right? The last one. It's quite interesting because if we think in this logic about allowing Belarus window of communication and not being so strict with the Belarusian regime now, we are coming to the same picture which has been described today by Professor Marples. When in 2010s and earlier, some political prisoners were released, and then Belarus, this window of opportunity was open for Belarus again for the relations with the European states. And now we came to a different point, because the situation after 2020 is different, qualitatively different from the one it was the one which was there before, and this very strict position of Lithuania and the punitive measures are basically the measures which work against the regime, and the regime in Belarus really wants. Really wants the European partners, the European states, the neighbors also, to see this tightening, more tightly relations with Russia as an unfortunate choice, and perhaps this particular argument is used during some closed-door negotiations with the European states. But this punitive measures and this very strict position of the European states, including the neighbors in Lithuania, is really one of the most working measures against the regime now. So if we speak about the window of opportunity, we're actually speaking about coming to the same situation in which Belarus was before, and this is the situation which is good for the regime.
Maria, I would like to ask you one more question regarding this recent peace deal, which the China and Belarus have been preparing for the Ukraine crisis. We have seen China's successes in Middle East when it comes to Iran and these countries, and it has been still trying a good amount of effort in even African countries. So how much do you think it would be effective when it comes to Ukraine, and how much is this story viable that China is trying to fetch peace for Ukraine and Russia? Yes.
Many thanks, Sumant, for a question. That's an interesting question, because when we look at the Chinese peace deal, the Chinese peace plan for Ukraine and Belarusian regime during the last visit announced that they completely support this plan. We're coming to the Chinese logic, but because this plan basically is has two sides, and it's mostly focused. The main purpose is to work for China's interests, and for China's interests, the end of the war in Ukraine is in China's interest. But at the same time, China cannot be on the side, cannot show itself to be on the side of either Russia, or of course we cannot speak about it because of the Chinese strategic policy against the West and with the West, or on the European side. So China proposed this golden line in between, and basically this plan is very close to the strategic thinking of let's wait and see what's going to happen. Let's take control without taking any active measures, any actions. That's why China has been focusing on the humanitarian aspects of the Russia-Ukraine war, but never said that this is a war itself, but just let's help the people. But when we look at the consequences of someone's actions, but don't name those responsible for these actions, it's just one side of the story, right? And this is just very illustrative steps taken by Chinese diplomacy, which, as I already said, prove that still China, even though the Chinese authorities want to lead the country towards being a global power, but in this particular conflict, which has been a surprise for China last year, still China is looking at from the side. And for Belarus, why Belarus supported China's plan is quite obvious, because Belarus needs more allies. It needs someone apart from Russia. That's why Lukashenko's regime was very happy to say that, yes, we are also with you on it. But it's just also the part of the rhetoric and some of the links which Belarusian regime may have with China.
Do you think also there must be some dividend for Xi Jinping when it comes to support receiving from the government of Belarus, and especially from a figure like Lukashenko? Yes, in solidifying his own legitimacy in China and politics, of global politics? Yes.
It's just, thank you for the question. It's just one more country. Belarus is one more country, one more regime which supports China. And while China now is coming out with its global development strategy, global security strategy, in all of this package of strategies which are intended to find more friends, more supporters, and then slowly to change the normative basis of the international relations right now. This is just one more ally for China, nothing more. Just one more country in this circle of friends for China.
Yeah, so I don't see any more questions in this participant. Yes, there is one, I think. Yes, so I think it is for Professor Marples. Yes.
Yes, I see the question about the comparison of NATO expansion with the Cuban Missile Crisis is a valid point. I take that point, Ardash, and I think if Russia tried to put missiles on Cuba, there would be a very strong reaction from the United States. There's no question about that. And United States operates by the Monroe Doctrine from the 19th century, where, you know, it wants to basically control the military situation in its own hemisphere. I don't agree with that, but I think it's fair to say that that would be the US reaction. But, you know, in general, I don't like this spheres of interest concept. I think it's outdated in a modern global world. And by condemning what Russia is doing in Ukraine, doesn't mean, for me anyway, that I would agree with what the Americans have done in Latin America and, or for that matter, Central America. So, no, this is just a Canadian perspective. I don't know whether it applies to other Canadians, but this is my perspective. So I agree with the comment. I think it's a fair comment.
Yes. So I don't see any more questions for the speakers here. So so all the lectures were extremely wonderful. So I would like to know if speakers would like to comment on each other's lectures or any question for each other. So we can do this and then we can slowly wrap up. Yes.
Well, I think, you know, for me, Maria's area of expertise is her area of expertise, and I wouldn't question anything that she said there. And Katsiaryna and I, we have very similar interests, you know, so we communicate a lot. So, you know, we know where each other's pretty well stands, and I think with her too, I don't really question anything that she said. You know, it's hard to interpret exactly what happened in 2020, but I agree with it that COVID was the key thing that made the difference from previous elections and actually ended that accord that I was mentioning. That social contract between Lukashenko and the population was basically broken, and in a very contemptuous fashion. And that this really was a huge mistake on his part. And that in earlier elections, you don't see him making such fundamental blunders. I mean, maybe it's just a question of being in power for too long, but certainly that was a huge mistake. And the whole idea of holding an election in the middle of summer where people are supposedly on holiday completely backfired, because it also meant people could demonstrate in mass numbers. You know, the kids were out of college and people weren't necessarily working up full time, and they could mass on the streets. So it really backfired. And I think he was very lucky to survive.
Yeah, Katsiaryna, would you like to say anything?
I want to thank my fellow panelists for also their remarks. Really enjoyed a lot. Perhaps I would just pick up on something that Maryia mentioned when she was talking about China and about this craving for recognition and legitimacy on the side of Lukashenko's regime that he badly needs. I just saw this question about the foreign policy and the Western vector that we did not really bring up, but I think it's really an important aspect that we are likely to see more and more attempts in the future on the side of Lukashenko's regime, regardless of his involvement in the war, repressions and so on, to reconnect with the West. And that's one of the traps that the West used to fall into in the past, that there were elections, they were repressed, but then somehow in a couple of years, the political prisoners get released and there is a period of normalization or something coming up. So I think there is this important moment of Western unity and to what extent it would be able to stay there. And I in particular wanted to mention the recent visit of the Hungarian foreign minister to Belarus that was a little bit, yeah, I mean, it was quite important for the regime and advertised everywhere as also a sign of recognition. So I just wanted to kind of talking about foreign policy that we touched upon Russia, China, but the West is also an important player. And even though, as I also mentioned, the opposition has gained incredible recognition in the West, meaning that the Lukashenko's regime lost this vector, but it does not mean that it will not continue to try to gain it back in this or that way. And so as time goes by and we are further away from the elections of 2020 and so on, and Belarus is not that much in the light of international attention. So that's the risk that is still there. So such events are really important. And again, thank you for bringing us together and organizing it.
Yeah, so Maryia, would you like to comment anything?
Yes, first, thank you, Katsiaryna, very much for picking up this question, because when I saw China in the last question, I completely focused on that and I just skipped the one above. So thanks a lot for coming back to this question. Yes, I completely agree with what you said on that. And I just want to thank my co-panelists, because it's quite a hard task to put all of these events, all of these developments, all of these specific points which we should keep in mind while thinking about Belarus, while watching at what is going on in Belarus, and you managed to do it in 15 minutes, so it's really brilliant. Thanks a lot for your presentations, and many thanks for the deep questions from our audience, and I think it's just what I want to say today.
Thank you so much to all our speakers and audiences for joining us. It was a great session on Belarus, and I hope we covered many important aspects of this country and this current geopolitics, as well as society and foreign relations of Belarus. So thank you for joining, and yeah, we would be there always with we would be there always for future collaborations on Belarus and topics aligning to Eastern Europe. And see you again. Yeah.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks.